On the afternoon of May 4th, 2014, the hallway of the 14th floor was unusually quiet. Holiday decorations still hung in the lobby downstairs, remnants of the Labor Day break. Most residents of the building in Dezhou had returned to their routines. Nothing about the exterior of the apartment complex suggested that anything had gone wrong. But hundreds of kilometers away, a son had already felt it. He had called his parents repeatedly over the past 24 hours. No answer. That in itself was not impossible. They were older. They didn't always keep their phones close. Yet something about the silence unsettled him. His father rarely left the apartment. A severe workplace injury years earlier had confined him to a wheelchair. His mother, fragile in health, structured her life around caregiving and hospital visits. They lived quietly in apartment 1403. Predictable, routine. Silence in that household was unusual. At approximately 4 p.m., police officers arrived at the building. The corridor outside apartment 1403 felt still, almost insulated from the rest of the city. The door was closed. No sound from inside, no television, no movement. Repeated knocks produced nothing. Then one of the officers noticed it. Near the base of the door, just along the threshold, was a dark stain. Small, dried, easy to overlook unless you were looking carefully. Blood, not splattered, not pooled, just a narrow mark, as if someone had stood there briefly while bleeding. The decision was made quickly. A locksmith was called. The lock was cut. When the door swung inward, the smell reached them first. Metallic, heavy, recognizable. The living room was in disarray, drawers pulled open, clothing scattered, papers overturned. It resembled a hurried search, but not a precise one. From the entryway toward the southern balcony stretched small droplets of blood. Between them, a darker smear marked what appeared to be something dragged across the floor. In the center of the room stood a wheelchair. There were visible stains along the armrests and wheels, but no one was sitting in it. Officers followed the trail toward the balcony. In the corner, partially turned toward the wall, lay the body of a woman. She was 57 years old. A towel hung loosely around her shoulders, soaked through and darkened. Beneath her, the blood had dried into a deep brown patch against the tile. The bathroom faucet nearby still released slow, intermittent drops of water. It was the only sound in the apartment. In the western bedroom, the scene was worse. The bed had shifted several inches from its original position, as if force had been applied during a struggle. Bedding twisted, clothing displaced. In the narrow space between the bed and wardrobe, no more than 80 centimeters, lay the body of a 58-year-old man. He was positioned face down. There were signs of repeated violence. At that moment, the number of wounds was not yet counted. The pattern was not yet analyzed. What remained undeniable was the intensity. This had not been a single strike in panic. It had been sustained. 2 victims, 2 separate rooms, 1 confined apartment, and no visible sign of forced entry. As investigators moved carefully through the living room again, documenting blood droplets and photographing displaced objects, one detail stood out in stark contrast to the chaos around it. On the coffee table sat a red liquor bottle, shaped like a traditional gourd. The cap was off. Less than 1/3 of the liquid remained inside. There were no glasses nearby, no indication that 2 people had shared a drink. On the glass surface of the bottle were visible bloody fingerprints. Someone had remained inside this apartment after the violence. Long enough to drink. In the kitchen, another detail deepened the unease. The gas line beneath the stove had been cut. The connection loosened. If the windows had remained closed, if a spark had ignited, the entire floor might have been destroyed. But it hadn't. The perpetrator had stopped. Why? If this was robbery, why the excessive violence? If revenge, why ransack the apartment? If premeditated murder, why leave fingerprints in blood? Why drink? Why tamper with the gas line, but not complete the act? The absence of forced entry narrowed the possibilities quickly. Whoever had entered apartment 1403 had likely been allowed inside, which meant trust, which meant familiarity. Outside, the city continued without interruption. Neighbors passed through elevators, unaware that hours earlier, inside one of the units, a confrontation had escalated beyond control. No one reported screams. No one recalled a disturbance loud enough to draw attention. Inside the apartment, time felt stalled, suspended at the exact moment when violence overtook reason. The bodies were removed. The hallway returned to stillness. Yellow tape sealed the doorway. Cameras flashed. Evidence markers were placed beside droplets of blood. And yet, even as the physical scene was documented, one unsettling truth remained. The person responsible had walked out of that apartment, on their own, and at that moment, no one knew how far they had gone. Before apartment 1403 became a crime scene, it was simply a quiet home on the edge of Dezhou. Neighbors described the couple who lived there as reserved, not unfriendly, just private. The kind of people who nodded politely in the elevator, but rarely lingered for conversation. Lou Fat was 58 years old. For most of his adult life, he had worked at a boiler manufacturing plant. It was not glamorous work, but it was stable. He had once supervised production lines, managed workers, understood machinery that ran on pressure and heat. Then, several years before his death, a workplace accident changed everything. The injury left him unable to walk. Retirement came earlier than expected. So did dependence. The wheelchair in the center of the living room was not temporary equipment. It had become part of the apartment's architecture, positioned carefully between furniture, leaving calculated gaps wide enough for movement. For a man who once stood at the center of industrial operations, the adjustment was profound. Financially manageable at first, psychologically harder to measure, his wife, Ngok Duyen, 57, absorbed the shift without visible complaint. She became caregiver, scheduler, medication manager. She handled hospital appointments, prescriptions, grocery trips, and paperwork. Those who saw her in the hallway remember a woman who moved quietly, often carrying small plastic bags from pharmacies. But her own health had begun to decline. Medical visits increased, bills accumulated, the couple received pension payments, but long-term illness is rarely predictable in cost. Some months were manageable, others were not. On paper, nothing about their life suggested imminent violence. They did not host frequent guests. They did not argue loudly enough for neighbors to overhear. They did not display signs of wealth or sudden financial gain. Apartment 1403 contained no safe, no luxury decor, no indication of hidden assets. And yet, buried within their past was a lingering financial thread. Years earlier, while still employed at the factory, Lou Fat had entered into a business arrangement with a scrap metal buyer. The transaction involved equipment materials valued near 100,000 RMB. A 30,000 RMB deposit had been paid in advance. The remainder would follow upon delivery. The full delivery never occurred. Then came the accident, retirement, medical costs. The unfinished business deal remained suspended, unresolved but not forgotten. The buyer eventually began requesting the return of his 30,000 RMB. At first, the requests were reportedly civil, then persistent, over time strained. 30,000 RMB is not an extraordinary sum in commercial terms, but in a household reliant on pension income and burdened by medical expenses, it becomes significant. For the buyer, it represented capital locked away. For the couple, it represented a debt they could not immediately repay. 2 months before the murders, on the evening of March 6th, police were called to apartment 1403. According to the report, someone had been pounding on the door aggressively late at night. The couple did not open it. They did not look through the peephole. They felt threatened. When officers arrived and asked whether they suspected anyone, their response was hesitant. A name was mentioned, but softly, followed by uncertainty. They declined to press charges. They did not want escalation. That decision is worth pausing on. When individuals fear confrontation, yet avoid formal complaint, it often signals complexity. Perhaps they believed the situation could still be resolved privately. Perhaps they hoped silence would reduce tension. Perhaps they understood the temperament of the person outside the door and calculated that legal involvement might inflame matters further. Whatever the reasoning, no restraining action followed. Life continued. Inside the apartment, financial strain persisted. Investigators later learned that shortly before the killings, the couple had managed to borrow 10,000 RMB, money intended for upcoming medical treatment. That sum would later take on unsettling relevance. But in early May 2014, none of this had yet turned violent. There were no security cameras installed inside the unit, no reinforced locks, no protective measures beyond ordinary caution. That suggests something important. Despite the earlier door-banging incident, the couple did not believe their lives were in immediate danger. The tension was real but not, in their view, lethal. Which brings us to a subtle psychological question. At what point does financial pressure shift from dispute to humiliation? For someone disabled, dependent, and already stripped of professional identity, repeated reminders of unpaid debt can feel heavier than the number itself. Conversely, for someone financially strained and responsible for a sick child or grandchild, money owed may feel urgent, even personal. Debt in isolation is arithmetic. Debt combined with pride becomes volatile. On May 3rd, sometime in the early afternoon, a man approached the residential compound where apartment 14003 was located. Security cameras captured him entering through the gate. He wore a crossbody bag. He did not conceal his face. He did not appear rushed. He walked like someone expected. Inside apartment 1403, there were no signs of forced entry, which means when the knock came that day, the door was likely open from the inside. The question is no longer whether the victims knew the person who entered. The question becomes, what was said in those first few minutes? And at what exact moment did the conversation cross a line from negotiation into something irreversible? The first real breakthrough did not come from a witness, it came from glass. The red liquor bottle on the coffee table, half empty, cap discarded, resting in the middle of a blood-streaked living room, was processed carefully. Technicians dusted its surface and photographed what was already visible to the naked eye. Smeared fingerprints, preserved in dried blood. The lab results returned quickly. The DNA profile recovered from the bottle's mouth did not belong to either victim. It belonged to a 45-year-old scrap metal buyer named Wang Quang. The name immediately resonated with investigators. It was the same name the couple had reluctantly mentioned 2 months earlier after someone pounded on their door late at night. Now it appeared inside the apartment, in blood. Security footage from the residential compound was reviewed frame by frame. At approximately 2:00 p.m. on May 3rd, a man matching Wang Quang's build entered through the front gate. He carried a dark crossbody bag. He did not attempt to avoid cameras. The footage showed him walking toward the residential buildings. But there was a problem. There was no clear footage of him leaving. Every exit camera was checked. No image of him walking out on foot. It was as if he had disappeared. At first, investigators considered the possibility that he was still inside the complex, hiding, injured, waiting. But a systematic search yielded nothing. Then a detail from building security shifted the focus. A black sedan had been parked inside the compound for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, partially obstructing internal traffic. Security had noted the vehicle, but had not been able to reach the owner before it left. The license plate was traced, registered to Wang Quang. Traffic cameras outside the residential area confirmed the sedan exiting around 5:00 p.m., a window of time consistent with the estimated period of the murders. The theory became more concrete. He had entered on foot. He had left by car. The vehicle was located days later in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Dezhou. It had been abandoned. Inside the driver's seat area, small but significant stains were discovered. Blood, not belonging to the victims. The DNA matched Wang Quang, which meant he had been injured inside apartment 1403. This detail altered the psychological picture. If he had planned a controlled execution, one might expect gloves, precautions, escape strategy. Instead, there were bloody fingerprints on a bottle, blood in his own vehicle, no attempt to burn or destroy the car. He had not cleaned the scene carefully. He had not erased himself from it. Meanwhile, investigators interviewed Wang Quang's family. His son described an unusual visit on the evening of May 3rd. His father had arrived without warning and handed him 10,000 RMB in cash. "Don't worry about me anymore," he reportedly said. "Take care of yourself." It did not sound like a casual remark. 10,000 RMB was a meaningful sum, and investigators quickly realized it closely resembled the amount recently borrowed by the victims for medical treatment. The implication was difficult to ignore. Later that night, Wang Quang contacted his younger brother, Wang Thiet. They met. According to taxi driver statements, one of the two men had a visible injury on his arm, loosely wrapped in cloth. They traveled together toward a rural county outside the city. Security cameras at a hospital entrance recorded them around 1:30 a.m. on May 4th. They stood near the gate, hesitated, walked back and forth. They did not enter. Instead, they left. At a nearby intersection, another camera captured the final clear footage of both men together. They paused beneath a streetlight, spoke briefly, then separated. Vuong Tiet returned toward the city by taxi. Vuong Quang walked alone into the darkness. From that point forward, he vanished from surveillance. At this stage of the investigation, the case shifted from identifying a suspect to locating him, but something about his movements unsettled investigators. He had not attempted to cross provincial borders immediately. He had not withdrawn large sums of money. He had not arranged long-distance travel. Instead, his actions resembled something else entirely. He gave money to his son. He sought his brother's company. He stood outside a hospital but refused treatment. He walked away alone. These are not typical behaviors of someone planning a long-term escape. They are closer to farewell rituals, which raises a different question. Was he running from the police or from himself? For several days, the investigation operated under a familiar assumption. The suspect was in flight. Alerts were issued across neighboring regions. Highway toll booths were notified. Bus terminals, railway stations, and low-cost hotels were checked. His photographs circulated quietly among local law enforcement units, but no new confirmed sightings emerged. Meanwhile, the abandoned black sedan remained parked in the industrial zone outside Dezhou, a silent marker of unfinished intent. Inside, beyond the blood traces, there was little preparation for disappearance. No packed clothing, no survival supplies, no secondary license plates, no sign of methodical planning. When investigators formally questioned his younger brother, Vuong Tiet, the emotional tone of the case shifted. At first, he minimized their late-night meeting, claimed they had only discussed a minor dispute, but confronted with surveillance footage and phone records, his account changed. He admitted that sometime after midnight, in a dimly lit roadside area near the rural hospital, his brother had confessed. He said he had gone to apartment 1403 to demand repayment of the 30,000 RMB deposit. The argument escalated, voices rose, accusations followed. According to the brother's statement, Vuong Quang described feeling cornered, though no weapon had been drawn against him. Then the knife appeared. What matters here is not only that he used it, but that he used it repeatedly. 17 times against Lu Fat, 14 times against Ngoc Duyan. Those numbers suggest duration. They suggest continued action after the first injury. They suggest a state beyond immediate self-defense. And yet, after the violence ended, he did not flee instantly. Instead, he searched the apartment for money. He located cash. He sat down. He opened a bottle of liquor. He drank. Drinking at a crime scene is psychologically revealing. It can signal shock. It can signal dissociation. It can signal the abrupt crash of adrenaline after extreme exertion. It can also reflect something darker, a ritual pause between action and consequence. Then came the gas line. He cut it. Investigators later reconstructed that if the windows had remained sealed and an ignition source had triggered combustion, the explosion could have damaged multiple units on the floor. It would have obscured evidence. It might have killed additional residents, but he did not complete that destruction. The windows were open. He left. That hesitation matters. If this had been fully premeditated mass harm, the sabotage would likely have been ensured. Instead, it appears as a gesture, almost impulsive, abandoned before execution. After leaving, he drove. He bled inside his own vehicle. He visited his son, gave him 10,000 RMB. Don't worry about me anymore. That sentence, placed after 2 killings, carries weight. He then sought out his brother, not to coordinate escape, but to confess. According to the brother's testimony, Vuong Quang did not describe a grand plan. He did not discuss border crossings or false identities. He described losing control. There is a difference between anger and collapse. Anger seeks victory. Collapse seeks ending. At the hospital gate, he hesitated. An untreated arm wound likely throbbed beneath improvised bandaging. Entering the hospital would have created a medical record, a traceable identity. It would have delayed whatever internal decision was forming. He chose not to enter. Instead, he separated from his brother and walked alone into the night. Investigators reviewing the timeline began to consider a shift in classification. The man they were searching for might not be evading capture in order to survive. He might be moving towards something final. In cases where suspects commit severe violence, followed by structured goodbye behaviors, distribution of money, confessions to relatives, avoidance of institutional record, the statistical likelihood of self-harm increases significantly. This case was beginning to follow that pattern. The problem was geographical uncertainty. Without surveillance coverage across rural corridors, a person determined to disappear, especially one on foot, could slip through unnoticed. Days turned into weeks. Media coverage remained controlled, not sensationalized. There was no public trial approaching, no courtroom date to anticipate, only absence. And somewhere beyond the city, a man carrying the weight of 3 irreversible actions was still unaccounted for. The question no longer centered on whether he would be caught. It became whether he intended to be found at all. 36 days after the killings, the search ended far from apartment 14003. On June 9, 2014, in a rural area of Ha Bak, a farmer reported a disturbing discovery. The village well, more than 15 meters deep and rarely used, had developed an odor. When authorities lowered equipment into the shaft, they located a body. Extraction required a pulley system. The well's diameter was narrow, roughly 60 centimeters. When the body was lifted, one detail became immediately clear. It had entered headfirst. The positioning was not consistent with an accidental fall while drawing water. There were no buckets nearby, no rope apparatus disturbed, no sign of struggle around the rim. Inside the pockets were over 200 RMB in cash, a set of keys, a wristwatch still functioning, no identification documents, no written note. Dental comparison and DNA analysis confirmed what investigators already suspected. The body belonged to Wang Quang. Autopsy findings indicated death by drowning combined with severe cranial trauma consistent with a vertical fall. There were no defensive wounds inflicted by another party, no evidence of restraint. The injury to his arm, sustained during the stabbings, showed no professional treatment. The bandaging had been improvised and left unchanged, which means from the moment he walked away from the hospital entrance, he did not seek help. The geography is important. The well was located hundreds of kilometers from Zhuchao. Reaching it required deliberate movement through rural terrain. This was not a man collapsing in immediate panic within city limits. He traveled, he navigated distance, he selected isolation, and then he climbed. A 15-meter well is not entered impulsively. It requires physical positioning, balance, and intention. The descent, or fall, would have been rapid. The impact immediate. No note was found, no apology written, no justification offered. From a legal standpoint, the case concluded there. The suspect was deceased, prosecution impossible, court proceedings unnecessary. But psychologically, the final act reframed the entire sequence. If the murders had been meticulously planned, one might expect escape preparation, forged documents, hidden funds, relocation strategy. If they had been coldly calculated, one might expect sustained evasion. Instead, what emerged was a compressed arc: argument, escalation, overkill, drinking, gas sabotage attempt, cash distribution, confession, isolation, self-inflicted death. The timeline between violence and suicide was not months, it was weeks, which suggests the killings were not the opening move of a new life in hiding. They were the beginning of an ending. 3 people were now dead, 2 in separate rooms of a quiet apartment, 1 at the bottom of a rural well. There would be no courtroom cross-examination, no formal statement of remorse, no sentencing remarks, only reconstruction. Investigators returned to the original question. Was this premeditated murder driven by financial motive? Or was it a confrontation that spiraled beyond control, followed by the psychological implosion of the aggressor? The distinction matters. Premeditation implies structured intent prior to entry. Implosion implies a tipping point. The evidence offers fragments in both directions. He brought a knife, but knives are common tools. He cut the gas line, but abandoned full detonation. He took money, but distributed most of it hours later. He fled, but did not hide effectively. He avoided hospital documentation, but left his vehicle behind. Each decision appears partially rational, yet incomplete, as if the mind making them was functioning, but fractured. By the time his body surfaced in that well, the legal narrative was closed, but the psychological one remained suspended, much like the stillness that once settled over the hallway outside apartment 1403. And the final question lingered quietly. At what precise moment did 30,000 RMB stop being a debt and start becoming a catalyst? With the discovery of Wang Quang's body in rural Habak, the legal trajectory of the case ended without a trial. There would be no prosecution, no courtroom testimony, no formal sentencing. The file was closed administratively, but closure in the psychological sense is rarely procedural. For investigators, the final stage became what some refer to as a psychological autopsy, reconstructing the internal collapse of a man who moved from confrontation to homicide to self-destruction in just over a month. The financial dispute at the center of the case was measurable, 30,000 RMB, yet the emotional weight attached to it was not. For Lu Fat and Ngoc Duyan, that amount represented debt layered onto medical fragility and diminished independence. For a disabled former factory manager reliant on pension income, repayment may have felt humiliating, an acknowledgement of instability. For his wife, already balancing health concerns and caregiving, it may have felt like another quiet burden added to a growing list. For Wang Quang, however, the same sum appears to have carried different pressure. Reports indicated his family faced mounting medical expenses related to his grandson's congenital condition. In such circumstances, unpaid money does not feel theoretical. It feels urgent. Urgency, when mixed with pride, can distort judgment. The violence inside apartment 1403 was excessive. 31 stab wounds between two victims cannot be explained by a single defensive reaction. It reflects escalation sustained beyond the first irreversible act. But what followed complicates interpretation. He did not attempt to eliminate forensic evidence effectively. He did not destroy his vehicle. He did not construct a long-term escape strategy. He confessed to a family member. He redistributed money. He avoided creating new traceable records. Then he removed himself entirely. These behaviors align less with cold calculation and more with psychological destabilization. One detail remains particularly unsettling: the gas line. Cutting it suggests awareness of catastrophic potential, yet the act was incomplete. Windows were open. No ignition source was set. The destruction that could have followed, potentially harming uninvolved residents, did not occur. That pause may represent the final intact boundary in an otherwise collapsing mental state. In the weeks after the case concluded, neighbors in Zhuchao returned to routine. The hallway outside apartment 1403 was cleaned. The unit eventually vacated. Physical traces disappeared, but the structural elements behind the case remain recognizable. Financial strain, medical burden, wounded identity, delayed confrontation, avoidance of formal mediation. No single factor alone produces homicide, but layered together under the right psychological conditions, they can create volatility. The most difficult question is not whether the crime was preventable in theory. It is whether there was a moment, a specific sentence, a specific decision, where one of the three individuals involved could have chosen disengagement instead of escalation. Had the March 6 intimidation been formally pursued, would mediation have intervened? Had either side agreed to structured repayment negotiation, would tension have diffused? Had one person walked out of the apartment during the argument, would three lives still exist? There is no definitive answer. What remains is a pattern. A financial dispute transformed into perceived disrespect escalating into rage, rage collapsing into irreversible violence, and violence dissolving into self-erasure. 3 deaths over 30,000 RMB. Not because the number itself was lethal, but because under pressure, numbers become symbols, and symbols can ignite far more than arithmetic ever suggests. Now the question turns outward. Do you believe this was premeditated? A visit fueled by intent from the beginning? Or was it a moment of emotional collapse that spiraled beyond recovery? Share your thoughts below.